Okay, we are about to start. Welcome everybody. Before we start this third series of Drawing the Pacific Blue Line, just want to welcome everyone joining us wherever you are calling in from. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please ensure that your mic is muted at all times. If you have any questions, please reserve your questions till the end. You can ask the question by introducing yourself, or you could also just drop your question in the chat box. And lastly, please note that this session is 1 hour, 30 minutes. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll hand it over to our moderator for today, Maureen Pendruelli, who is the coordinator of the Pacific Network on Globalization.
Again, just joining Joey in welcoming everybody. Nisambula Vinaka, Noa E Mauri, good morning, Olgata. And as Joey said, this is the third webinar by the Pacific Collective, which includes Dawn, a Southern feminist organization that's headquartered here in Suva, Fiji, PIANGO, Pacific Conference of Churches, and PANG. Looking at deep sea mining. The Drawing the Blue Line series looks at how the Pacific Ocean, from its surface, through the water columns, right down to the ocean floor, has become a site of contest, the last frontier for resource grab. A conquest of conflicting interest, imagined and drawn along old and new political and economic powers. These lines interrupt and disrupt lines that existed before modern state constructs that we know today, such as song lines, including those tracing genealogy across time and space, carefully balancing the past in the care for the future. It really is my privilege today to welcome Hilda Lini. For those that might not know Hilda, she is synonymous with Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, a true revolutionary, an advocate for Indigenous people's rights to self-determination, and environmental justice. Motari Lavoa Hilda Lini is a chief of the Turanga Nation of Pentecost Island in Vanuatu. Following independence, Hilda became one of the very first women elected into parliament and held several portfolios, including Minister for Justice, Health, and Foreign Minister. As Minister of Health, she was instrumental in persuading the World Health Organization to bring the question of the legality of nuclear weapons testing to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. She was also the director of the Pacific Conference Resource Center and was representative of the Pacific region at the UN Non-Proliferation Review Conference. She has a Bachelor of Arts with a major in journalism from the University of Papua New Guinea. Today, Hilda will be sharing with us her wealth of experience, knowledge, and wisdom, both as a traditional Indigenous leader, but also recognizing her contemporary leadership roles across the Pacific. With that, I'll hand it over to Hilda, and I will turn off my camera just to allow for connections. Hopefully the internet will hold. Thank you. Hilda.
Aminio, can you just unmute?
Thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of this session, PANG, PCC, Dawn, and others, for making it possible for us to be able to communicate today. I have been asked to speak about traditional governance in Melanesia, but more so in Vanuatu, and also the issue that we are looking at is seabed mining, but the experimenting in seabed mining, which is for economic purposes. And I would like to start off by saying that in 2003, the Tonga Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific declared with a resolution the decade for the ocean. We already declared the decade for the ocean 2004 to 2014 because of the way the ocean had been manipulated by different people who are really looking at the economic benefits from the ocean. And as indigenous people, we feel that the ocean holds so much for sustaining our lives as Pacific people, especially in the Pacific, but in other oceans as well. Because of that, our life depends on the ocean. And when it is being manipulated in such a way, we feel threatened by the fact that our water and our food sources and our marine resources is being manipulated and destroyed, or we feel insecure about that. So I refer to that because I understand that the UN is also looking at declaring the decade for the oceans, mainly on the scientific level, and looking at how that could be observed. And I remember the decade for the ocean that the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Conference in 2003 in Tonga had declared the decade for the oceans, because NFIP, which is made up of indigenous peoples from 29 countries around the Pacific Basin, was already looking at that because of the concern that we have that our water and our food resources is being robbed from us. So I'd like to say that the way I look at the deep sea experiments with seabed mining is like the test. It's like the test that other people are trying to test in the Pacific region, and I compare it and I recall the kind of test that the Pacific has been going through, especially the nuclear test that had gone on in the Pacific for 30 years, 1966 to 1996. And we had to live with it. But then what happened was we stood up and fought against it until it was stopped in 1996. But then when it stopped, they said that by that time, all the experiments that they needed to do, they had carried it all out. So it had been completed, and now it was time to move it to their laboratories in France. Of course, the testing went on for 30 years. That was the French, but then before that, it was the British, and then the Americans. And this seabed mining is, I see it as the same, in the same context that we are the custodians of this area, and we are not being consulted. And then other people come in and try to mine our water and our resources and our food, marine resources, all of that. So I do not agree with it, and I'm so glad that PANG and DAWN and PCC, you are all standing up to lead us in in the campaign against this. I remember some years back here in Vanuatu, there were the ship that came around to do the experiment, and they came into Port Vila Harbor, and then they went out to do that, and that was Nautilus. But then after a while, we did not hear about it anymore, what had happened to it. And now turning to the indigenous or traditional, but I would always refer to our indigenous ways of living. I would like to say that as indigenous people, we refer to the ocean and the seabed and the ocean floor as the mat of the planet Earth. It is the mat. So everything depends, their life depends on the mat, which is the ocean. It carries everything. That's from the ocean floor, the ocean, the reefs, the seashore, and then goes up to the land, the rocks, the rivers, the lakes, birds and animals, fish, everything, all the organic, all the organisms that survive. We all depend on the ocean and the ocean floor, because that is the mat. That's the mat of the planet Earth. In our indigenous language, we say that it is the mat of the world, of the ocean, of the earth. So when we look at how the mat holds together the life of everything, it came about right at the beginning when the universe was created. And then with the creation of the universe, the indigenous belief in the universe, which we call the universal system that existed then. Before any other system came to us, we knew about the universal system that existed. And it's the universal system that has the indigenous or the universal belief which the indigenous people have really taken it seriously as the universal belief system. And with the universal belief system, there's also the creation law that had been created by the creator. What are the laws of the natural world? It's the natural laws of life. What are the laws? And today, we need to really find out what are the laws of life based on these natural laws. Because with that, there is also the spirituality that is guided by these laws, or the laws, spirituality that guides the functions of everything. For the indigenous people, we take it as the most important system for us, and that's why indigenous people are more connected to the universal system, to the natural laws, to the creation laws, to spirituality. And then there is the traditional governance system, or the indigenous governance system that governs the life that we live, not just the people, but the life of everything, all the organisms that depend on each other. So the ecosystems that's there is what we believe as indigenous people to be the most important natural ecosystem that was put together by the creator when he created the world, and it still continues to sustain life today. It still continues to sustain life today. So when we are threatened, especially by different factors that come in and threaten our lives, we feel so insecure about this. And this is why I have become very vocal on Indigenous governance issue, because with the Indigenous system and Indigenous governance system, there is no politics in it. It's about the natural way of life that was given to us by the Creator to look after this planet, and the universe. There's no political manipulation that goes on, and there's no Christian or other religious ways of coming in to say this is how it should be done, this is what you should do, this is what you don't do, because it's based on customary law, the creation law and customary law, which is more natural to us. And why it is natural? Because the central focus of the Indigenous system is peace. It is peace in every, at every level and in every dimension. It promotes peace in our lives and the lives of everything else that depend on each other. So it's the peaceful coexistence that is there, which is the main focus of the Indigenous system. And when you look at everything else that happened, including our own governments, the way we have conflicts with these new laws that have been introduced to our different countries, is because governments allow these new laws to come in without having any respect to the sacredness of the Indigenous laws, the creation laws that have been there for generations, from generation to generation for so long. The government does not have much regard on that. They look at the modern law just in itself as modern law, without looking at the interconnectedness with the Indigenous creation laws and customary laws that are there that sustain the life of our people. So it's the way of, this is why I have been very vocal on Indigenous system, Indigenous laws, Indigenous governance, because it looks after the life, the environment, and everything that we have, like water and fire and everything that provides for us. Now, in the with the ocean, with the seabed mining that is being experimented at the moment, it has been experimented for a while, but we can see that when there's disturbance to the mat of the ocean, the mat of the planet, when there's disturbance and there's destruction in that, it is going to affect every other life, because the ocean for us, especially for us in the Pacific, is like our mother. We depend on it. We eat from it. We wash in it. And we are just custodians today. Our elders used to look after it. And then came the time when they really fought for it at some point, when the ocean and the environment was being threatened. Today, it is us who are sitting here in today's life. What do we do about it? And I'm so glad that PANG and PCC and Dawn are taking leading roles in leading us to stand up against the different disturbance and destruction that's going on, because it is, we need to unite we need to unite and work on it. Like I said, we need to learn from the experience of the nuclear testing that was taking place in the Pacific, and how we were able to stop that. Because we all fought for it, and all the churches, all the organizations, there were governments that, all the governments that were against it, and then we managed to get everybody to stand against it and then stop it. And that's what we should do with the deep sea mining, or seabed mining, or ocean floor mining that is going on at the moment. Now, I remember that way back in 1975, I remember my brother, Father Walter Lini, talking to the indigenous leaders on our home island. He told them that no mineral should be mined on our island. That was in 1975. It was before independence. He said we should not mine anything that's in our, it's under the ground, because we have not made use of everything that is on the surface of the ground and the surface of the ocean yet. Why are we going under the ground? Because we're going to destroy the environment. And he said, the only time we can mine also is when we are able to process it ourselves here on the island or in Vanuatu, but not to be sent for processing overseas. And he said that then, and up to today, there's gold on our island, but it has not been mined up to today because of the way indigenous leaders then looked at the life and how the island depends on the natural resources that are there. And then he, as a political leader at that time, said it very clearly to acknowledge it so that there is no mining. Now, I can see that as the other aspect of the seafloor mining, because even with the seafloor mining or seabed mining, we are not going to control it. We Pacific people, especially the indigenous people, we don't control it. It's other people or other companies coming in and controlling it. Controlling it from the beginning, where they give licenses. They give the government give licenses to these companies to experiment without even asking us indigenous people our consent, so that they can use the sea. According to our indigenous concept of who is the custodian of the land and the ocean and all that, we have a saying that says, your area ends where the horizon is, where you can look until it ends at the horizon. Now, that means that even the sea reef, anything that's there, indigenous people on my island believe that it belongs to them. Beyond the horizon, it belongs to the others who can see up to that horizon. But everything that we can see from our island to the horizon belongs to us. And that's the saying that goes, but that's also the law that says, the customary law that says that. And even though there are modern laws that have come in and put in place the land laws and the ocean laws or ocean policy and all that, that's all to do with modern law that has come in from elsewhere. But the indigenous law remains. The indigenous law remains, and our constitution in Vanuatu also gives us that right where it says that all land in Vanuatu belongs to the indigenous people, indigenous owners. And it also states that the land belongs to us, and we manage it according to our custom system, our indigenous land tenure system. So that helps us to be able to look at the rights that we have over the land and the ocean, and even to challenge people who do not respect the sacredness and the values that go with the ocean and the land. And this is very important to us because when the Constitution says so, even though it says so, there are governments or government ministers or individuals, members of parliament or other government people or private individuals who collaborate with these manipulators who come in from other big companies from other countries to try and get us to agree to it. But it's not the indigenous people who agree, it's the governments. It's the governments and the government leaders that collaborate with them to agree. And I believe that the power still remains in the hands of the indigenous people. Vanuatu, for example, the indigenous governance is here. It's everywhere. We call it traditional governance. We also call it indigenous governance, but it is here. And the power that it has is that in Vanuatu, government doesn't own the land. The land is owned by indigenous people. All land in Vanuatu is owned by the indigenous people. So it gives us that power to be able to say that, who are you to manipulate the ocean floor, the seabed, the oceans, the land? When other people come in, you can question that to them. Of course, there is also land transaction that's going on at the moment and buying of land and all that. But the indigenous people stand strong to say all land in Vanuatu belongs to the indigenous people. So the way land is being transacted from one person to another foreigner who is not an indigenous person is only done because government and modern law allows it to happen. But we believe that our creation law and the customary law still gives us power to be able to look after our land, because land is our survival in Vanuatu, and the economy that these people are looking for in experimental seabed mining, they're looking at the economic side of it. Everywhere in the Pacific, including Vanuatu, we have the traditional economic system that sustains our life. And that's the most important thing. Until you eat everything, all the products from your garden and from the land, and nothing is left to eat, then you can go and look at other foods that's not readily accessible right there. But at the moment, we have enough in the traditional economy or indigenous economy to sustain our life and the life of the next generation and the next generation. The only thing we need is that this indigenous knowledge continues to sustain this system so that the next generations will be sustained by the same traditional economy or indigenous economy, and also the technology, indigenous technology that is used to maintain this. We need the knowledge to be able to continue. And that knowledge is very important because today, as we look at our youth and our young, we are all going to school, and unless the school teaches us this knowledge, a lot of this knowledge is not with the younger generation. And you can only find it with the elders who live in the villages, elders, the women, the men, people who have the knowledge to be able to share with us. So this is the indigenous belief that indigenous people have, because we see the ocean and the land and everything as our part of our integral life. We integrate with it. Without it, we will suffer because we are not part of it and they are not part of us. What I want to say now is that in the way we organized ourselves in the Pacific to fight against the nuclear testing, I believe that we could do the same with new technology that we have today that has upgraded our knowledge to be able to use other means as well. And we should be able to use the same with new technologies that have come in to mobilize our people to stand against experiments that are taking place in our oceans. I would like to say here that we need to reclaim our ocean. We need to reclaim our place in the ocean, we as indigenous people, and we need the support of everyone elsewhere in the world to help us reclaim this. And we need to stop all these experiments that are going on because we have not been given the opportunity to give our consent as custodians of the ocean, custodians of the land, custodians of the sky. We haven't given our consent for them to do experiments in our area. At the same time, I believe that we as indigenous people, and I don't know how it's going to be organized, but we could sign the ocean concession among ourselves so that indigenous people of one country, Melanesia or Micronesia or Polynesia, the ocean concession gives them the right of custodianship and ownership of their own ocean, so that we could protect our ocean from being over-harvested and being manipulated for experiments and all that. So I believe that there are still ways to be able to put out or to declare our ownership to our place and to the oceans and to the land, so that we are able to have control over all this which belongs to us. And at the same time, I believe that our past has taught us, and even our elders, our past generation didn't have the legal means to be able to fight this actions that's taking place for economic purposes by different big companies. But today, I believe we have our legal people, our own, who will be able to help us to fight these things, even up to the Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice. There are means to do so. In Vanuatu, I don't know whether you all know about it, but we have two islands in the southern part of Vanuatu, which the French claim to be theirs. And we have indigenous right over it, and we claim that these two islands belong to us, and the French just took these two islands very recently in when our plane landed there because they had problems. And then they decided, is now before the International Court of Justice. Vanuatu is taking it up to that law and the customary law that we're claiming this based on the indigenous song to Vanuatu. So I believe the indigenous song and the customary law has a lot to teach us. I remember in 1999, I stated that the Pacific needs a second revolution. And I believe that this could be the second revolution that we are looking forward to. Because our life is being threatened when there are experiments going on with our seabed and the seafloor mining. Okay. So I am going to finish there, Maureen. I think I've said quite a few things, but I really look at the collaboration between all the indigenous states. Government doesn't have to do it for us because they'll never do it for us. We have to do it ourselves. And our indigenous nations, we in Vanuatu have 43 indigenous nations. And these indigenous nations, we are ready to sign the ocean concession as the indigenous governance of Vanuatu. We are ready to sign the ocean concession with other Melanesian countries or Polynesian countries or Micronesia to see how we can really take full control of our oceans and do not let other people manipulate it for their own purposes. So I think I will stop there and I leave it to you to comment or ask questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Hilda, for a very provocative, challenging session. And I hope all of those who have listened in, if you could start thinking about questions, you could either post the questions up into the Q&A section, or you could raise your hand to ask your question. But whilst people are still thinking about their sets of questions, and perhaps I'll ask Joey to assist with the queuing of the questions and answer session now. But I think we've got some very strong reminders of history. I mean, it's always clear that the Pacific is a trailblazer. Vanuatu is a trailblazer. The fact that the Pacific and the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement declared Decade of the Ocean ahead of its time, 2003 to 2014, recognizing the centrality of ocean in terms of the interest, economic interest to our countries at that time, and certainly more significant, the whole referencing of how similar nuclear deep sea mining is to nuclear testing that took place in the Pacific by the United States of America, the British, and of course the French. What lessons that can offer us in current context in dealing with deep sea mining and the kinds of experiments that are still taking place in our ocean. The real clear statements around indigenous creation laws, customary laws, traditional resource management, not just for ourselves, but for future generations and for all living creatures. This is not just a human-centric view of the world, but it's quite holistic. The idea that, and I think you really ended quite high with the tension between modern laws, which sees resources as the right of our governments and states, and customary laws and certainly traditional indigenous systems of governance of resources. The fact that in deep sea mining, our governments do not have our consent for mining to take place in our waters, and certainly the proposals going forward that we people can consider, including ocean concession, and that people can sign on to ocean concession. So, any questions? Does anyone have any questions at this time? We have one here, and I'm just going to read it, Hilda, unless you want to ask this. Would you like to ask this question? Okay, so let me just read it out then. Has an ocean concession already been initiated between Pacific Islands? If not, what is your vision for it, and how do you see governments engaging in the process? The microphone is not working. So Hilda, that's the first question that's come through.
The ocean concession, we have a draft of it, but this is the Indigenous Peoples Ocean Concession. It's not the government ocean concession, because when governments do theirs, there is so much negotiation that goes in it, because it changes the whole idea because of the different outlook that comes out and the different, well, what's the word? So this is only among indigenous peoples and indigenous governance. An indigenous governance system, like I said, they exist in all our countries, but we are not making use of them. We only make use of the modern governance system, and because they are governed by modern law, and we understand them more in today's situation than our own. Which is why in Vanuatu we've set up our own system of education that teaches these things to our people. And in February of next year, it is establishing the university level of the indigenous education system to be able to look at all these things, including the customary law, the indigenous law and the customary law. If there is any concession that is with them, I am not aware of it, but I'm talking about the ocean concession, which is going to be signed between the indigenous governance of different countries.
Thank you, Hilda.
It's a huge work. It is huge because when we talk about these things, we don't know where to start. So I leave it to you.
Okay. There's a question from Nick McClellan. Nick, do you want to ask your question? Bulvanaka Nick.
Thank you, Maureen, and greetings to Hilda from Naarm in Australia. Hilda, you were talking about the customary agreement between customary leaders from Vanuatu and the FLNKS and so on in around Matthew and Hunter Islands. I had a couple of elements related to this. Has there been much support for this Kiamu agreement from other MSG countries? Have they talked to Vanuatu about the importance of that in the dispute with France? And secondly, at a time the Pacific Islands Forum is pushing for countries to sort out their maritime boundaries, is there a danger that that will open the way for seabed mining? That one of the limits on seabed mining is that there are still boundary disputes that will complicate companies moving into the region. I wondered if you could comment on those two elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. And good to hear you and good to have discussions with you again. Whether other countries, especially Melanesian countries or other countries in the Pacific, have been supportive of this, I am not aware of any concrete support that has been coming in, but I am aware that the issues really at hand is Fiji collaborated with France to take over, to exchange the islands, to make, to give the two islands to confirm the two islands belong to France. And then that was Fiji. And then of course the French government has a different view of it, while the FLNKS and Vanuatu has signed the agreement stating that the two islands belong to Vanuatu because in the indigenous way, they belong to Vanuatu. So that is that. And the other one is the boundaries that, your question about the boundaries, whether it's going to encourage other seabed mining around the boundaries are signed up or not signed up yet. I know there are two boundaries that have been signed up, and that's to do with the two islands, and the other one is between Vanuatu and Solomon Islands. With that, there has been discussion with other countries on how we can look at the other setups, but one of them is Fiji, but that is still at the early stage of discussion. But that's all I. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilda, and thanks, Nick. I think there's quite a bit of interest in terms of the ocean concession, Hilda. Perhaps there's another next step process that we can think about, how to make this available, how to begin the discussions around the ocean concession. Maybe that's something that we can think about with the team in Vanuatu and bring that out to the region. So that's one feedback. Just in terms of Nick, I think the question on the using of customary knowledge and to reclaim territories is quite important, particularly in boundaries negotiations that's taking place across the wider Pacific. We know that up in the Marshall Islands, they are using similar customary laws, custom law, to reclaim territories that were lost to colonial powers when they were drawing the lines around EEZs and obviously the extension to continental shelf. So I think there is something that we probably should look at a little bit more in terms of how to formally get formal or UNCLOS to recognize these kinds of customary boundaries that existed before colonial powers redrew into modern states. Squire Jeremiah would like to ask a question. Squire, if you could ask a question if your microphone is on. Squire? If Squire is, can I ask Marioni to ask your question while we see if Squire, oh, here we go. Hold on. You're still on mute, Squire. Can you hear us? Jeremiah, you need to just unmute yourself. Can I just go to Marioni now? Marioni Chung, would you like to ask your question? Okay, I think there's lots of problems on the internet. So can I just ask Marioni's question, Chung? It's, what are your thoughts, Hilda, on the Indigenous fight against climate change and how this can link to the fight against deep sea mining? We seem to be having problems.
Thank you for the question. I think that's the main question that is in front of all of us and the world. Climate change
Apologies, colleagues. Hilda, you may have to answer that again. The internet dropped.
Thank you so much for the question. I'm just want to say that climate change is a big question that is this climate change that is here. And while we are trying to cope with that and seeing what should be done, we are also coping with these experiments that are taking place in the Pacific. And we need to know our priorities. What is it that we want to tackle? Because climate change, for the indigenous from the indigenous point of view, it happens because of the way we have not been respecting the indigenous or the universal commons that are there, like Earth is what we live on, but if we have not been respecting it enough, then it fires back against us. That's the climate change. And it's the same with the ocean bed or sea bed. If it is there, because all these things in the indigenous belief, they all have sacred values of everything that is there, that has been created by the Creator. When we do not respect the sacred values, then they start to fight back against us because we do not respect them. And the seabed mining is going to be the same. If we do not respect the sacred values of the ocean bed, and all that, it is going to start fighting against us. I just want to quote a statement from an indigenous leader from an indigenous village community that they've never been Christianized. They continue to live in their indigenous ways of life. When I went to ask them a question on at the beginning of the millennium, I said, what is it that you still have, the knowledge that we still have and the knowledge that we've lost? What is it that we still have with us today? And this indigenous leader, he's a scientist, he's an indigenous scientist. And he said, we can manipulate everything that is here today. If we want it to happen, something to happen this way or that way, it can be easily manipulated. There's only one thing that we cannot manipulate, and that is the ocean. That's the sea or the ocean. And he said, we cannot manipulate that because if the sea is dried today or the ocean is dried today, the full planet disappears. And these are people who've never been to school, but they have that knowledge from the indigenous knowledge that has been lived according to indigenous law and customary law, but that's what he said. So I can see that even with the ocean mining, seabed mining, if we continue to, if the governments continue to allow it to happen, then it's going to fight back against us just like the climate change is fighting against us. The ocean is part of the climate change. The ocean is part of that biological diversity that is, has been created by the Creator at the beginning. And we are here to look after all these organisms that are in place so that it does not affect us in when, you know, with our lives. We continue to live with them, not on them. We do not rob them of whatever, but we live as the integral part of our lives together. Our life depends on them, their life, the lives of all these other organisms depend on us. So that's all I can say about climate change and the seabed mining.
Thanks, Hilda. Can I ask Melanesian women today if you could just ask your question rather than me reading it out?
Hey, hello everybody. This is Mere with Melanesian Women Today in Seattle, Washington. So my question is, what are the specifics regarding deep sea mining that we can start teaching our children around the house, our houses, or even in schools, from an Indigenous belief or perspective, so that we can all they can be informed of what's going on from that perspective. Thank you, Tabiana.
Thank you very much for your question. I didn't get the name, but thank you so much for the question. I'm just going to mention here that for the younger generation or our children, how do we teach them to, and what aspects of the ocean or the deep sea mining that we want to teach to our children? I would like to say that the indigenous system of education begins in the home. In the home, And it's that education that we start educating our children to respect the sacred values that have come with the creation of everything that exists around us. We are only one of the species. There are so many other species around us that we exist with them. And we need to teach our children to know that we all live together on this planet and we need to respect each other. And that's the sacredness of that that respect that we need to have at all times. And respecting them, meaning that we do not apply anything that is harmful to them. We respect them with peace, we live in peace with them, and we respect their existence as well as ourselves. So I would say that our teaching to our children is what has been the teaching in our homes, where parents start educating the children to respect the sacredness and the peaceful coexistence that we need to have, and the values that go with it, because we all depend on each other. Thank you.
Friends, we have about 10 more minutes left for the question and answer time. If you have any, I don't see a raising of hands. I had two questions for Hilda. And one is really, how do we start to reclaim, particularly in relation to contemporary modern law, where the state has particular rights, particularly to minerals, whether they're on land or on the sea floor. How do we start to reclaim that? Because the governments really see minerals as the, in terms of ownership, that's owned by governments themselves. How do we begin to regain and take control of those particular legal systems that we have, which are really placing disproportionate burden on our communities to challenge and to assert their custodianship over resources? So how do we do that? Secondly, you referenced the upcoming decade in terms of ocean science, which is launched in 2021 up until 2031. Obviously, science will become a big driver, and therefore research will become a big driver. Scientific tools such as conservation, protected areas will become quite critical in terms of discussions at national level. What are some of your views around Indigenous knowledge systems and the premise in which we, states and governments in particular, will rely on science? How do we resolve the two? Can it be resolved, the tension between modern laws and Indigenous laws, legal system, or Indigenous systems of governance, and in particular science and science-driven? How do we resolve those tensions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen. The first question. I believe we all are in the state of conflicts everywhere between the indigenous system and the modern system. There are conflicts everywhere, and Vanuatu has these conflicts going on all the time up to now. So when we talk about reclaiming, we need to look at what are the steps that we need to take to reclaim. For example, we ourselves as individuals, how ready are we to reclaim what is ours? Because a lot of us, like I said, we all go to modern schools, we all live by modern law, we all go to churches, and everything is colonizing our minds. Every day we are being colonized. So how do we decolonize our minds and become that indigenous person or that Pacific person that you can stand on your own feet and say, I am ready to do this. So I see a lot of ways that can be done, but then it's really up to each of us, because I talk about it. I'm a university graduate. I have been to the school up to that level, and I've traveled the world around and all that. In 1996, I decided to go back and learn my indigenous system and indigenous laws, 1996. And who asked me to go back and do that? It was my brother who asked me to do that. And since then, I've never regretted learning about the indigenous knowledge, indigenous laws, indigenous systems that is all linked to the natural systems that came with with creation. So I believe that we can reclaim slowly, but because it's really up to individuals and how many of us that are ready to do that. Let's get together and talk about how we can do that, what step to take to do that. The next question is on the decade of the ocean, which is more to do with the scientific side of it. I just want to mention here that in 1999, my brother spoke at the indigenous school, and he said that the modern scientists have destroyed the world. Our world has been destroyed by modern scientists to the level where they are now meeting the different cliffs that are before them, and they are not able to go through to overcome those cliffs. And the world is being destroyed by the scientists. He mentioned that, and I was sitting there listening and surprising that that would come out, but that's what he said. And when you really look at it and think about it, it's really about what is happening. And this is, again, another scientific experiment that they are doing with the oceans. And like I said, are we ready to accept them to do that? Or individually, we are ready to say no? And if we are ready to say no as individuals, then we are ready to say no as a collective. We are ready to say no as a community. The power that I see in Vanuatu on these kinds of issues is that for the independence of Vanuatu and independence of Kanaki and Tahiti and Guam and all those other places, here in Vanuatu, everybody is for independence of those countries. We've all accepted that. When it came to nuclear free Pacific, everybody is for nuclear free Pacific, including the government. Independence for colonized countries is the same, including the governments. The churches, everyone is for it. So I can see that we can actually do the same thing against scientific experiments that are taking place in our ocean by standing together as individuals, as communities, as churches, as organizations, and we can actually convince our governments to be able to help at that level to stand with us. Thank you so much.
Just back to see if there's anyone who has a last minute burning question or comment that they would like to share.
Can I make one or ask one question, because there have been really already such very good questions. I had some others, but Hilda, thank you firstly for a stunning presentation. That was just so full of inspiration, but also it was like vintage NGO activism. You know, it was wonderful to hear your voice. You drew on history, you drew on, and I found this wonderful to hear your perspective of, you know, the Indigenous worldview, if you like, or view of you know, the planet and the interconnections. You gave us ideas of how we can strengthen the campaign. I had a question about how do we engage? I mean, what ideas do you have for how we can build a, or strengthen this campaign by drawing in Indigenous movements, which you would be connected to, both within the Pacific and outside. But the question I wanted to ask, and I'm so glad you talked about collaborators. I mean, you made a mention of, used that word. My question is, how do you, or how would you suggest we deal with or confront collaborator states? You know, and thank you for telling us about what Fiji did in terms of supporting France's claim. What a ridiculous thing to do to the two islands. And I'm so pleased to hear that Vanuatu is challenging this at the, challenging France's claim at the International Court of Justice. We will watch this case with great interest. But how do we deal with collaborator states that are leading you know, the push for and actively engaged in moving towards being involved in mining the seabed in the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone? And there are 4 states in all, you know, and there are a couple of them that are really particularly in the lead. But how do you think the movement should actually be confronting these states, and how would you suggest we would do so, if you agree?
Thank you so much, Claire, for the question. My view is that there is the collaborators need to be stopped. But then, how do we do that when a lot of these governments at the moment operate without the people or the communities knowing what is happening? Before we know they've signed an agreement, before we know they've signed an agreement or they've given a license and all that, without knowing that. So we need to be vigilant as NGOs and individuals and academics at what levels, and share information about what is happening because they hide a lot of these things because they know it's not correct to do it. But then most of them are members of parliament or ministers or prime minister. And so the way to tackle it is to make sure that we get rid of them during elections, that they don't get elected. And we need to have a campaign that is strategized to make sure that people who have done wrong in the past against our state or our nation should not be re-elected to those positions. And Vanuatu is going through court cases after court cases. At the moment, the court case against the former prime minister is going on. The court case against the previous prime minister was already there. And he's not allowed to hold any public position for a certain number of years. After you really, and public positions mean that he cannot stand to be but then how do we know that the next ones become collaborators like these other ones? They all seem to learn from each other how to do it. So we just have to be vigilant about it and expose it as much as possible. And I believe that with the social media and Facebook and all that's going on at the moment, we can expose a lot of these people from continuing with what they have been doing up to now. That's how I see it, and I'm really looking at campaigning at that time to stop them from being elected again into parliament. Thank you so much. What was the other question?
We are now out of time. I think that was unless there's anyone else, but otherwise I would like to wrap this session up and really to thank Hilda for taking the time out, for the Vild and VKS team for providing support in Vanuatu. We are moving into new forms of engagement. Zoom is still new. The internet connections in the Pacific remains quite weak, but I think it's quite possible for us to host a lot more. I think there's a lot of interest in the challenge that you've put forward to us, Hilda, in terms of how do we take back the control? How do we reclaim our oceans and Indigenous people's place in the ocean? How do we stop the experiment? Our governments do not have the consent of its people for these experiments. As Claire pointed out quite rightly, vintage reminders of our history and where we come from, but the complexities of this campaign going forward. Unlike the nuclear testing case where this governments stood strongly with the people of the Pacific, this time around we have collaborators who are promoting an untried and untested industry from taking place in our waters and on the very mat that holds life together. So very big thank you to Hilda, to the team, and again to everyone. Next week we've got Dr. Claire Slatter, who will be coming to present next week on the question of control, but looking at the case study of industry and deep green in particular. So please do join us again. Joey sent some details if you're interested in the campaign that we are running. We will be reaching out shortly to everyone on a position that I think the Pacific, as Hilda's pointed out, we need to run this as a campaign, standing very strongly and firmly indicating to the world that deep sea mining has no place in Pacific waters and in our territories. Thank you again, Olgata, and we will see you again next week. Details will follow. Manaka.
Thank you so much.